Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Action Awareness, I'll be talking about Crittercube of the Itty Critters. Crittercube states, choose a minion in play of power 3 or less owned by any player. Shuffle it into your deck. I hate this card, and I have been delaying making this video for weeks. I'll be breaking this video into 3 separate parts. The part you're not expecting, the part where I'll make some enemies, and the part where I'll distract you from the second part. First, I consider Crittercube to be one of the cards that single-handedly destroys the ability to play with faction duplicates. Not that you should anyway, it's completely unnecessary, but Crittercube makes it extremely impractical, if not impossible. If we're both playing dinosaurs, and I shuffle your War Raptor into my deck, when I draw a War Raptor, whose is it? If your copy is sleeved, then the card clearly sticks out in my deck, which is problematic. So the sleeves would have to be either identical or all cards would be unsleeved. And unless you want to go to great lengths to either mark a card or drop some form of marker in the sleeve, you'd have no way of differentiating between them. Trade has a similar problem, but you could always remember a card's position into your hand. Winds of Change would manifest the same problem, but Crittercube just does it all in one card. So if you played with faction duplicates before, and again, you shouldn't, Crittercube makes a breaking issue that makes it extremely impractical to use. This may be the only aspect of the card I like, other than the theme. The card is just too problematic, and it is a rules nightmare in my opinion. I'd like to start by apologizing in advance to anyone who disagrees with me on the subject, because I honestly don't see my opinion changing. It's not you, it's Crittercube. There's a common question I see, one I've even asked myself, which is, if you steal a minion with Crittercube, what happens when you play it with Critter Champion or similar cards? Does it go back on the bottom of your deck, or does it go back to your opponent? This is a situation where I know and I understand the official ruling, it goes to the bottom of the owner's deck, and I disagree with it wholeheartedly. Not because of the reasons given, but because it creates a terrible precedent, one that the Vikings will make infinitely worse. The main rule in question is on page 13 of the Big in Japan rulebook. When a card that others can see goes to the hand, deck, or discard pile, it goes to the card's owner, i.e., the player whose deck it came from, no matter who played or controlled it. Thus, a little reading of the rule would indicate that it goes back to the owner. However, if this were always true, then Crittercube wouldn't work at all, since it would contradict the aforementioned rule. Instead, since the very first Smash Up rulebook, on page 9, it clearly states that when card text and rules conflict, card text always wins. It has a black belt in Rule Fu. The black belt in Rule Fu was maintained as recently as What Were We Thinking, before mysteriously vanishing in Big in Japan. But Big in Japan's rulebook still mentioned that the card text wins, and that is why Crittercube works, despite it being a direct contradiction. So now I ask, how is Critter Champion not a direct contradiction as well? The card clearly states, if you control the card at the end of the turn, place it on the bottom of your deck. Barring an explicit change of controller, you would still be the controller, therefore you would do the rest of the ability, which says to place it on the bottom of your deck, not the owner's deck. The official ruling states that this is not a conflict, and that's the part I cannot wrap my head around. Because it is a conflict. To say it's not calls into question what a conflict actually is, and that's a terrible precedent. Crittercube states, owned by any player, which is apparently differentiating enough to be considered a conflict. It's almost as if the card has to explicitly acknowledge that it's conflicting with the rules. But consider what Critter Champion says. If you control it, place it on the bottom of your deck. The card is telling you to do one thing, the rules say that it should go back to the owner, so each source is saying a different thing. If that's not a conflict, then you and I have conflicting definitions of the word conflict. I also don't understand why the word owners is omitted from the card text. This is a distinction that was made as early as Disintegrator of Aliens from the core set, which says to place a minion on the bottom of its owner's deck. Therefore, the word choice comes across to me as intentional, and it has to override the rules. If this isn't meant to be a direct contradiction, then I challenge you to tell me why, since I'm not sure how else place this on the bottom of your deck should be interpreted. I can understand why the powers that be would want to be more conservative with this exception of getting opposing cards into your hand. There are many ways to do something similar. Based on wording alone, Muffin to take control and Dr. Wen should return the card to your hand and give you permanent control. Dr. Wen never says owner's hand, whereas Into the Time Slip does. Disguise would also have the same problem when combined with Muffin. But I don't see how two cards combining to do the same effect would not be allowed when one card can do it, as Critter Cube alone steals a card from play. I could see wanting to break down a powerful effect into two cards, but instead Smash Up did the opposite. Not only is Critter Cube now inconsistent with every other ability, but it has created a ton of arguments and discussion in games I played. Conflicts should not be subjective, and that is what happens when you make an exception because this one card was worded slightly differently. It's not just the legal issues with the card that annoy me. There's also the question of utility. The first clause states, if you control it at the end of your turn. Why wouldn't you? There are very few cards where this would not be the case, and they almost all involve giving control away. Playing control minions of the Geeks would change controller, but that's one card and incredibly specific, not a good reason to write the card in a specific way, particularly for a different faction. Most of the examples come from the Ignobles, who can give control away, but Faction A really should not be designed such that the only exception is Faction B. Flower Child can also change controller, but again, that's one card of a different faction and too esoteric. So why use the word control? You have to use some form of distinction. Smash Up could have used, if this minion was still in play, meaning it was not used to break a base or somehow survive the scoring base, but I like the idea of the theme manifesting itself. Thematically, you cannot recall a creature that you do not control, which is why the emphasis is on the word control, not own. I have to believe that if the intent was not to be able to reuse the card, they would have said, if you own the card. This brings me to the second clause of the ability. If you didn't place it on the bottom of your deck, then Critter Cube would be an incredibly useless card. The card only targets minions of power 3 or less, which can easily be taken control of with Muffin. Both cases would give you one turn with the minion, but at least Muffin's would be immediate. Instead, Critter Cube would provide delayed satisfaction, and you may never see the benefit of that minion. If the minion had a strong on-play ability, a copycat could have provided that ability immediately. In the case of I Select You, using two cards just to get a minion's ability for one turn is incredibly inefficient. This would severely weaken the itty critters and water down their individual actions. In fact, I Select You allows you to search for a minion of power 3 or less, when the itty critters have 0 minions of power 3. Critter Cube also lets you steal a minion of power 3, so these cards were clearly designed to work together, which also makes the placement on the bottom of your deck all the more glaring. By design, their minions seem weaker since only the Critter Champion has a persistent ability, but Critter Cube seems to have been designed to combat this. Don't like the minions you have? Capture your own. If I wanted to remove the minion from play, I would just use Disintegrator or destroy it, and there are plenty of cards to do this. There's also the fact that Critter Cube puts it into the deck as opposed to your hand. There is precedence for putting opposing cards into your hand with cards like Trade or Wood for Sheep, admittedly never in play, but the itty critters are designed to search through your deck. Almost every card that puts a card in the hand or discard pile specifically mentions the owner, but not I Select You and itty critter minions. Therefore, they have to be designed to work synergistically with the Critter Cube, and if they aren't, then A, Smash Up is breaking its own rules per my original point, and B, I don't really see a point to this card at all. This is supposed to be one of the most powerful itty critter cards. What does it say when the faction's primary mechanic severely weakens that action? You're better off just drawing it and playing it normally. Bear in mind, the minion you capture is likely to not be a unique minion. there are generally 3 copies of Power 3 minions, so is your best action just to borrow a minion's ability for a short while? I really like the Itty Critters, but this limitation makes them really hard to play. But the part that really infuriates me is that this special case isn't covered as a clarification in either the original rulebook or the Big Crazy rulebook, at least not the latest edition that I've seen. And there are plenty of straightforward scenarios covered as clarifications, so it can't be a case of this being too obvious an answer. Either way, there should be an official answer in those clarification sections, even if it's one I disagree with. The only clarification provided is that you draw and play the other player's minion just like any other card in your deck. When it leaves play, it goes back to the owner's deck. Which doesn't make any sense. When it leaves play, it should go back to its owner's discard pile, just like any other card in play. The deck is a specific location, not a general concept, and cards have to be explicit. I hate all the confusion that this card causes. In fact, I'd rather this card never have existed because it creates too much confusion. I know Trade started all this, but it's the Itty Critters card that had the unusual clause to put them on the bottom of the deck. So now that I've successfully burned a lot of bridges in all likelihood, let me try to redeem myself or at least distract you from all that rules lawyering. What should you do with this card? Honestly, given the lack of replayability of a minion you capture, you may want to consider stealing the minion and leaving it in the deck. If you play it, the owner can get it back and use it to their advantage. Imagine taking a Tenacious Z off the board for the rest of the game and how much that would limit a zombie player. If you snatch an Invader, the alien player would likely just beam it back to their hand and get much more VP out of it than you. I'm pretty sure I lost a game because I left Black Magic Hat in play and Lunar Captain was played 3 or 4 times as a result. If your opponent has no discard retrieval, then stealing and using the minion is okay. But if they do, the best move is likely to capture the minion and deny them that for the rest of the game. Eventually you will draw it, but unless you have a ton of card draw, you should not worry about the dead weight in your hand. If you are inclined to play the minion from your hand, you should target a minion that functions like a good setup card. Because the Itty Critter minions are primarily end-of-turn base finishers, you might want someone with an engine ability. Of course, this is completely dependent on who your opponent plays, but you should be able to follow that general rule. I realize that's a lot to unpack, and I do respect everyone's opinion on this card. I know I'm not the only person who has issues with the ruling, so let's discuss it in the comments. Also, tell me your definition of the word conflict. If Critter Champion doesn't conflict, I'd like to know what cards other than Critter Cube do conflict with the rules at this magnitude. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.